It was June 5th, 2014, in Geneva, Wisconsin, when a road crew worker cutting grass along North Como Road spotted something unusual: two suitcases ditched in the tall weeds. He simply shoved the luggage out of the way and carried on with his mowing. At the time, he had no inkling of the grim discovery he had just bypassed. Finding discarded items wasn't out of the ordinary for him. But a little later that day, a driver passing by noticed the suitcases were still sitting on the shoulder. Except now, they were crawling with flies. Feeling that something was deeply wrong, the motorist called the authorities right away. He insisted an officer needed to come and see what was inside. Responding to the call, police departed the station and soon arrived at the location. They pried open the luggage and found the curled-up bodies of not just one, but two women. One of the bodies was clearly in a much more advanced state of decomposition than the other. The police immediately cordoned off the location, treating it as a homicide scene, and both victims were transported for forensic examination and autopsy. Medical examiners observed a profound difference in the state of the two sets of remains. One victim was so badly decomposed it suggested she had died many months before the other woman. Her body was found partially covered in black plastic trash bags, her wrists bound tightly behind her back with rope. The second woman's body was in far better condition and wasn't wrapped in plastic. She was discovered nude, a rope still encircling her neck and a red ball gag secured in her mouth with a collar. These chilling details, the bindings, the gag, and the ropes, strongly suggested both women had died from asphyxiation. With very few leads from the dump site itself, detectives dove into missing persons files and forensic evidence to try and put names to the faces. Initial observations led them to believe one victim was a woman in her middle years, while the second was considerably younger. They estimated her age to be somewhere in her teens or early 20s. Investigators soon had a crucial break in identifying the older victim. In just a matter of days, her fingerprints and description matched a new missing persons file from Minnesota. She was identified as 37-year-old Laura Simonson. Laura was a resident of Farmington, Minnesota, and had last been seen alive in Rochester on November 2nd, 2013. Her mother had officially reported her missing on November 22nd of that year. Laura's identification transformed the case into an interstate investigation. She was last accounted for at a hotel, the Microtel Inn. On June 12th, detectives paid a visit to the motel, where they learned that on November 2nd, 2013, Laura had registered with a 52-year-old man. The hotel provided their guest register, which gave them the name of the man she had checked in with. He was Stephen Zelich, and he had checked out, alone, the very next day. This was the break they had been waiting for. Armed with this crucial lead, detectives in Minnesota got a warrant and began to process the hotel room where Stephen and Laura had stayed. Simultaneously, other investigators began to dig into Stephen's background, quickly learning that he was a resident of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. To be precise, he resided in a suburb known as West Allis. His current job was as a licensed security officer, but they soon found out Stephen was a former police officer. As suspicion grew, Wisconsin police initiated surveillance on Stephen, while the forensic lab rushed the evidence tests to the top of their queue. On June 24, 2014, the police announced a major development. They had found physical evidence tying Stephen to both women in the suitcases. Authorities did not reveal what the evidence was, but they confirmed it was solid enough to establish probable cause for an arrest. At that moment, Stephen Zelich officially became the prime suspect in the investigation. On the 25th of June, it was time for the police to make their move on Stephen. The 52-year-old was arrested at his place of employment. The arrest was carried out without a struggle, and Stephen was taken in for questioning as police dug even deeper into his past. It came to light that he had joined the police force in 1989, serving as an officer in the Milwaukee area for roughly 12 years. But his career in law enforcement had ended suddenly in 2001. The reason was an internal investigation into a disturbing off-duty altercation. In May of 2001, a prostitute Stephen had met in a bar fled his apartment half-clothed in absolute terror. The woman would later tell police that Stephen had restrained her, and that she only managed to escape when she heard him retrieving a pair of handcuffs. Stephen flatly denied any attack, claiming she had attempted to steal from him and that no assault had taken place. He did, however, admit to soliciting a prostitute, a direct violation of department regulations and the law. Facing almost certain termination and potential criminal charges, Stephen opted to resign from the police force in August of 2001. After leaving law enforcement, Stephen maintained a low profile, finding work as a security guard. He lived a solitary life, and to those who knew him casually, he was just a quiet neighbor. On the surface, his life seemed perfectly normal, which is how these stories almost always begin. But in the shadows, Stephen cultivated a disturbing obsession with dominance, bondage, and sadomasochism. By 2007, he was prowling multiple websites dedicated to these fetishes under the alias Mr. Handcuffs. He built a persona as a seasoned dominant seeking a permanent submissive partner, once writing that he was looking for a long-term 24/7 slave for absolute ownership. His detailed fantasies included this person being bound, gagged, blindfolded, hooded, chained, and caged. He also imagined leading them by a collar and leash, a depraved secret life completely walled off from his family and colleagues. To the people who knew him, the name Mr. Handcuffs meant nothing at all. In fact, on the very morning of his capture in June of 2014, Stephen was still logged into these sites on his phone, suggesting his hunt was ongoing right until the authorities closed in. Once he was in custody, the case against Stephen moved with incredible speed. He waived his right to remain silent and willingly told investigators a grim, detailed story about the fate of the two women found in the suitcases. Stephen confessed that he was the one who had taken both of their lives. He confessed to ending the lives of Laura Simonson and another, younger woman who remains a Jane Doe, but insisted their deaths were not what he had planned. According to Stephen's account, both deaths were tragic accidents that occurred during consensual role play involving restraints and asphyxiation. He explained to investigators that he connected with both victims on internet message boards before setting up face-to-face encounters. In these private get-togethers, Stephen would bind and asphyxiate them, all part of a script they had supposedly agreed to beforehand. However, he alleged that on both occasions, things spiraled out of his control, and he took it too far, ultimately leading to their suffocation. Stephen recounted the gruesome specifics for the authorities, detailing the moments he realized each woman had slipped from consciousness into death, which sent him into a panic. No attempt was made to resuscitate either of the women. On the contrary, Stephen acknowledged that his immediate focus was to conceal all traces of what he had done. Following the first woman's death in August of 2012, he folded her body into a piece of luggage and brought it to his residence. There, he used a large refrigerator to preserve her remains and slow down the natural process of decay. More than a year passed before Stephen connected with Laura in Minnesota in November of 2013. After Laura perished in the same horrifying manner inside the hotel room, Stephen concealed her remains within a second suitcase. The cold weather offered him some cover, so for a while, he just left Laura's suitcase sitting in the trunk of his car. By early 2014, Stephen was now hiding two bodies, one chilling in his personal refrigerator and the other stashed in the trunk of his car. It wasn't long before the logistical nightmare and the constant pressure started getting to Stephen. Panicked about being found out, Stephen made the decision to get rid of both bodies in one go. He heaved the suitcases into his car and drove them out to a secluded rural area in Wisconsin he knew well, where he tossed them into the high grass. Stephen confessed to all of this in his police statements, painting the deaths as terrible accidents he'd tried to cover up in a panic. With Stephen's detailed confession in hand, prosecutors didn't hesitate to press formal charges. A judge set his bail at a staggering $1 million. At the same time, authorities were stuck on identifying the second victim. Although Stephen had admitted to ending her life, he insisted he didn't even know her name. The victim was a ghost. Her fingerprints and DNA didn't match anything in any system. Critically, it appeared no one had ever filed a missing person report for her. By mid-June of 2014, police released a composite sketch of the woman, hoping her face, her estimated age, height, and unique features would trigger a memory. It was the first time the public had seen her face. The sketch revealed a young woman with a slender build, prominent cheekbones, and teeth that were particularly noticeable. The hope was that someone, somewhere, would recognize her. The image was distributed nationwide. It went far beyond Wisconsin, traveling nearly 2,000 miles away to Oregon, where it found its way to people who had lost touch with a familiar face years ago. When several people saw that sketch, they thought it was an uncanny likeness of someone who had simply vanished back in 2012. Those individuals immediately alerted authorities in both Oregon and Wisconsin, voicing their suspicions to the police. They were convinced this person was Jenny Games. Jenny was only 19 when she vanished from Oregon in 2012. She'd mentioned to friends and her foster family that she was leaving town, possibly for California or somewhere in the Midwest. But not long after she was gone, she fell completely out of touch. Jenny was known as a quiet and artistic young woman who had navigated the foster system before she aged out. When the calls and letters stopped, no major investigation was ever launched. Based on that crucial tip, Jenny's dental records were brought in and compared against the remains model. It was at a press conference on June 30th, 2014, that authorities officially announced they had identified the second suitcase victim as a woman named Jenny. The face from the sketch was no longer a mystery. She finally had a name. As July of 2014 began, the pieces of the investigation were falling into place. Investigators now knew the identities of both women, and Stephen had admitted he was responsible for their deaths. But with the killings happening in two separate states, the case became a jurisdictional nightmare, involving two distinct prosecutors and two simultaneous homicide investigations. By August of 2014, the states reached an agreement. Wisconsin would proceed with its prosecution first. During his initial court appearances, Stephen pleaded not guilty, and by the end of 2015, the stage was set for a jury trial. But then, in a stunning reversal, in January of 2016, right as the jury selection process was about to kick off, Stephen changed his plea in the matter of Jenny's death. He admitted guilt to a lesser charge of first-degree reckless homicide with a dangerous weapon, along with a charge for hiding a corpse. This plea arrangement allowed Stephen to acknowledge his role in Jenny's death while dodging the far more serious charge of intentional murder. When Stephen's sentencing hearing convened in Wisconsin in March of 2016, the court was presented with a horrifying account of Jenny's final hours. Drawing from Stephen's own account, the court heard how he met Jenny at the Milwaukee airport in late 2012 and brought her to a hotel in Kenosha County. They were together for a few days, and on their last day, Stephen bound and choked Jenny as part of what he described as a sexual game. He maintained that he had accidentally killed her by choking her, claiming he lost his senses and couldn't stop in time. Consequently, for the killing of Jenny and the concealment of her body, Stephen received a 35-year prison sentence. The judge remarked that Stephen's conduct following the death, such as refrigerating and then dumping her body, showed an absolute and callous disregard for the victim's life. The following year, in February of 2017, Stephen was back in a courtroom, this time in Rochester, Minnesota. And, just as he had in Wisconsin, he chose to enter a guilty plea rather than face a trial. He pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree, which acknowledged intent but lacked premeditation. Throughout the plea hearing, as his own defense attorney posed a series of questions, Stephen admitted for the first time in a public forum what he had done to Laura. He confirmed that his first contact with Laura was through an online platform and that they had made plans to meet in person. He then, when asked directly in court if Laura died because he had stopped her from breathing, Stephen offered a chillingly simple reply: correct. The Minnesota judge accepted Stephen's plea and moved on to the sentencing phase, handing him a 25-year prison term for second-degree murder. The judge visibly fought to maintain her composure as she delivered her statement. She informed Stephen that human life is not a game and reminded him that Laura was deeply cherished by everyone who knew her as a mom, sister, daughter, and friend. Crucially, the 25-year Minnesota sentence was mandated to be served consecutively. In practical terms, this stacked the two homicide convictions into a 60-year term of imprisonment. Since Stephen was 55 in 2017, he would be around 115 years old before being eligible for release. Serving a 60-year sentence at his age was, for all intents and purposes, a life sentence. Then came the sentencing for concealing a corpse, which tacked on another 10 years to his time. Ultimately, his total sentence came to 70 years in custody. Throughout all the legal proceedings, Stephen never deviated from his core story that the deaths were accidental, but his guilty pleas ensured that this claim was never challenged in a full trial with evidence and witness testimony. Stephen conveyed only a perfunctory apology, which was delivered by his attorneys. He consistently spoke in a quiet, emotionless tone when responding to the judge, and he made no significant statements of remorse to the victims' families as they watched on. Members of the victims' families were granted the chance to give impact statements to the court at sentencing. In Minnesota, several of Laura's relatives, their voices breaking, described the profound pain Stephen had inflicted on them. Laura's sister spoke of the crushing heartbreak of their mother having to outlive her own daughter. She also voiced her rage that such a gentle and trusting person had been stolen from them in such a brutal manner. She added that Laura had been a vulnerable woman who had contended with mental health issues. Laura's family also expressed their deep dissatisfaction with the 25-year sentence, which they felt was completely insufficient. In Wisconsin, Jenny's family was not present in court, as they lived thousands of miles away in Oregon. Her foster mother did, however, submit a statement portraying Jenny as a brilliant young woman whose future was stolen far too soon. The fact that none of her other relatives made the effort to be there was a tragic footnote. Stephen began his incarceration in the Wisconsin prison system, where he was designated as a high-risk prisoner. This was due not only to the high-profile nature of his case, but likely also for his own safety, considering he was a former police officer. In the years after his conviction, Stephen made an attempt to take back his guilty plea in the Wisconsin case. In 2020, he submitted a post-conviction motion, which asserted that his defense lawyer had been ineffective and that he was therefore due a hearing on the issue. However, as of the most recent information available, no court has overturned any of Stephen's convictions. Public records show no successful appeals out of Minnesota, and Wisconsin court dockets confirm that Stephen's convictions on all charges remain firmly in place. It is highly unlikely that any of these motions or appeals will ever succeed in shortening Stephen's prison sentence. Jenny's remains were transported back to Oregon, where her family laid her to rest in a private ceremony. People who knew Jenny remembered a free-spirited young woman with an effervescent personality who had survived a very difficult upbringing. A former high school counselor recalled that she craved stability and love, two things that had always seemed to elude her. In Minnesota, Laura's family has found it difficult to heal. Laura was a mother to 7 children. She had lost custody of them before her death as a result of her own personal struggles, but many people remember her as having a kind heart despite the hardships she faced. Today, Stephen remains behind bars in a Wisconsin correctional facility where he is expected to spend the rest of his natural life.